Chapter 1. The man struggled. He twisted, pulled, and fought as hard as he could, but it was useless. The woman attacking him was the strongest person he'd ever encountered, the strongest thing he'd ever encountered. He'd tried to hit her, but found only empty space when he swung. He'd tried to kick her, and the one time he managed to connect, he screamed as his shin, ankle, and toes cracked in several places. It was as if he had tried to drop kick an anvil. He tried throwing a couple of elbows, only to yelp again as more of his bones splintered upon impact. He couldn't move or see much of her now, but he could feel her, and what he felt mirrored what it must be like to find oneself embraced by a car accident, pinned motionless by unyielding metal and sharp, fiery objects. He tried to move again and failed. The panic coursing through his veins flooded into what was left of his consciousness. He cried out, because while the pain in his neck was excruciating, the agony gripping his spine and crushing his ribs was growing worse. Elizabeth heard the whimper. She reached up with one hand and covered the man's mouth. She never once removed her teeth and lips from his neck. It wouldn't take much longer. The man's struggles flagged and faded until finally they stopped altogether. His body convulsed several times, another whimper spilled out of his throat, and he went limp. Elizabeth withdrew her teeth, pulled back, and licked her lips. They tasted of warm salt. She held the body at arm's length, cocked her head to the side, mimicking the corpse, and stared into its eyes. There was nothing there. Not anymore. No fear, no horror, no soul. A single tear slipped down the body's cooling cheek, and Elizabeth smiled. "Thank you," she said. She licked the corpse's throat, studied its empty gaze once more, and let go. The body fell for several 100 feet and collided with the water with a sickening finality. Even from so far up, the vampire heard the splash. It was a nice sound, solid, complete, finished. Elizabeth licked her lips again and flew back towards the lights of the oceanfront boardwalk. The buzz that enveloped her after a kill was always a good one, dangerous, but also divine. And this one made her happy. In the beginning, she'd had quite a hard time controlling herself after a hunt and feeding like the one she'd just enjoyed. But she'd learned, and now she used the wild energy, the almost sexual frenzy that erupted within her after taking prey. The man she'd just killed had a friend, who was no doubt wondering where his accomplice had gone. Elizabeth was intent on educating him. Peabody's nightclub was packed. It was almost always that way on Friday nights during tourist season. The club had been around since the early 90s, so even the locals still came here, despite avoiding the rest of the oceanfront below 45th Street during the summer. There weren't many places left that were older than 20, 30 years, so generally speaking, the city's residents avoided the Strip. There were countless other places a local could go for music, drinks, and the company of single others, spots that didn't reek of the annoying and aggravating atmosphere drenching the Virginia Beach Strip from early June through late August. The locals knew the good places well and did their best to keep them secret from the hordes invading the city each summer. The internet had made that harder and harder to do over the years, but there were ways around that, ways of keeping the tourists at bay. Despite its lack of charm during tourist season, though, the Strip was a wonderful place to hunt. A lot of predators used it, and a few of them were better hunters than most. Elizabeth strolled past the extensive, overheated, and somewhat desperate line of patrons waiting to get into the club and its hopefully cooler air. She flashed a smile at the bouncers checking IDs and made her way through the glass doors behind them, much to the chagrin of several curious and attracted onlookers. The giants guarding the entrance just nodded and grinned as she passed. One of the behemoths glanced over his shoulder and couldn't help admiring her figure. He was positive her body was perfect, flawless, almost too exquisite, and painfully so. He swallowed hard, pulled at the crotch of his black jeans, and looked back down at the ID he held in his now trembling hand. His chest hurt, and other areas were throbbing as well. It was going to be a long night. Vampires had spent most of the last century cowering behind their closed and well-hidden doors. But now, ever since word had seeped out that they were no longer being hunted, most had shed the security of the dark alleyways and forgotten parts of the city. Elizabeth knew of maybe 6 other vampires in the area, and all, but one, were now venturing forth and testing the waters again. A little dip here, a fang or two there. Elizabeth was enjoying it. After so long living in isolated fear, it was amazing. The music was loud, the temperature in the club over 80, despite the building's extensive air handling system. Partygoers were shedding clothing left and right. Blasts of cold fog enveloped the dance floor every few songs, and each time they did, the throng was reinvigorated. Glistening bodies writhed and danced to the music erupting from the speakers, while a DJ with long purple dreads bobbed her head on the elevated stage. Behind her, various lasers and intense swirling lights flashed and strobed out over and into the undulating crowd. Elizabeth pulled off her little white blouse and abandoned it to the sweat and grime-covered floor. She'd buy another. That one had blood on it now anyway. By the time the night was over, the hundreds of partygoers would have trampled it and its dark red evidence into gross, sticky oblivion. The staff would toss whatever was left of it into the trash tomorrow, and not long after that, the blouse containing the murdered man's blood would be forever lost. Elizabeth wove her way into the sea of bodies in a silver-sequined bikini top and form-fitting black leather pants. Her dark hair cascaded over her shoulders and down her back. There was still a bit of blood in it. She spied the man whose friend she'd just killed dancing with a petite blonde. The girl was clearly drunk. Probably drugged, like the last one, really. But she wasn't stumbling yet. Elizabeth moved in. One more snack before retiring for the evening. One less monster in the world. The vampire glided up to the couple and smiled over the girl's head. The man couldn't help but notice her. Elizabeth didn't even need to use her thrall. She would later, of course, but for now she had his attention. And why not? Elizabeth was the most gorgeous woman there. She was the only woman in the sea of young girls, tall, sexy, and confident, a feature just as attractive as anything else. He was a tall kid, too, probably 6'1", 6'2", in his early 20s, very fit, with a haircut that screamed military. He smiled over his prey at Elizabeth and moved to sidestep the little blonde. Elizabeth looked down at the girl and willed her to find a friend, call for a ride, and go home. She added a little fear and leaned down to the blonde's ear. "Don't ever let a guy you just met hand you an open drink again. Ever. And stay away from the clubs for the rest of the summer. Study. Learn to knit, draw, whatever, Elizabeth murmured. The thrall slammed into the girl's subconscious like a wave of stone and pure intent. She stumbled a little, looked up at the beautiful vampire, blinked several times, and drifted away. The vampire turned her attention back to the other predator. "Hello, cutie," she said over the music. The boy tore his eyes from the girl he'd drugged, and after a moment smiled at his new target. "Hi yourself," the dead man called back.